Good morning, everyone. Bom dia a todos. Boa tarde. Boa tarde. Does everyone speak Portuguese? I think pretty much, because there's some things that I might need to translate from Portuguese, but if I just say them in Portuguese, that would be even better if everyone speaks Portuguese. Not everyone. Okay, so I'll still translate. So I'm very excited to be here, honored. I've known many people who have attended Brown, who teach at Brown, and this is my first time here. So I'm very thankful from Dr. Green and Ramon Stern and everyone for the invitation. So I want to talk about some new work, a new project that I'm working on, and I actually did some research this summer on this project. The title is Ancestralidade e Aquilombamento, Black Feminist Activists Occupying Spaces of Power in Bahia. On July 25, 2019, the Dia Internacional da Mulher Negra da América Latina e o Caribe, the International Day of the Black, Latin American, and Caribbean Women, Black women gathered in major cities all over Brazil for the Marcha das Mulheres Negras, the March of Black Women. July 25th has been celebrated since 1992, when a group of women organized the first Encontro de Mulheres Negras Latinas y Caribeñas in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, and created the Rede de Mulheres Afro-Latino-Americanas y Afro-Caribeñas. I was in Salvador to do research on Black women's activism during the month of July, known locally by Black feminists as Julio das Pretas, or July of Black Women. Julio das Pretas was launched by Odara Institute of Black Women, Odara Instituto da Mulher Negra, as a proposal for a Black feminist agenda for Bahia, with the purpose of raising awareness about Black women's struggles and achievements, and to commemorate the International Day of the Afro-Latin American and Caribbean Black Woman. Valdecir Nascimento, executive coordinator of Odara, stated, "It is necessary to strengthen the 25th of July throughout the country. It will guarantee respect and visibility for the struggle of Black women. We want to mobilize the maximum number of Black women's organizations possible in Bahia. It will reaffirm July as a month of Black feminist intervention in Bahia." 7 years after its initial founding, Julio das Pretas has spread all over Brazil. In its 7th edition in 2019, the agenda for Julio das Pretas had nearly 100 events all over the Northeast. One of my interviewees, a 51-year-old Black lesbian activist named Jacira, said that Julio das Pretas gives visibility to Black women. Quote, "It's a time when all eyes are turned toward us." Another interviewee, Julia, said that Julio das Pretas goes from the base to the big events, and it wakes up young Black women. I attended the Marcha das Mulheres Negras in Salvador this summer, and the theme was Mulheres Negras por Nordeste livre do racismo, da violência e pelo bem viver. Black women for a Northeast free of racism, violence, and for good living or good life. On the Facebook page for the march, organizers wrote, "The march will bring together a plurality of Black women to shout out against racism, violence, feminicide, LGBT phobia, maternal mortality, obstetric violence, the genocide of Black youth, religious and environmental racism, to protest welfare reform, cuts in education, and all forms of fascist and white supremacist oppression and ignorance that dominate national politics." We gathered in Praça da Piedade starting at 1 p.m. Staff from Odara kicked off the march by welcoming everyone and inviting people to share their thoughts with the crowd on an open mic. A 14-year-old boy from the peripheral neighborhood of Nordeste de Amaralina talked about the importance of the presence of schools at the march. It appeared that his teacher had brought the whole class. The young man made a comment that rejected misogyny, homophobia, and transphobia when he said, "O lugar do homem, mulher, do gay, do trans é onde ele quiser. The place of men, women, and LGBT people is wherever they want." Another speaker, Milka Martins, spoke about the urgency of Black women saying no to all forms of violence, to the various forms of violence that they suffer. It turned out that she was secretary of Sindoméstica, the Union of Domestic Workers, and hailed from the peripheral neighborhood of Mata Escura. She encouraged everyone in attendance to form women's groups in their communities and to work with women from the neighborhoods in the periferia. Martins pointed out that the first to be hit by the recent Social Security reforms would be Black women, and she got emotional when she spoke about the unjust situation in which Black women domestic workers often find themselves in. Quote, "The system is killing our kids, and they ask, 'Where's your mom?' and we are working taking care of white children and don't have anywhere to leave our children, end quote. After Milka Marchin's speech, Odada staff members gave rousing speeches with lots of neighborhood shout-outs. There were multitudes of black women of all ages gathered in the plaza. A capoeira group called Sonho do Zumbi performed with mostly women capoeiristas jogando, or playing capoeira. People went up to speak and read poetry. Soon after the march set off through the crowded Avenida 7 de Setembro, the mic was open the entire time as we walked down to Cruz Caída and Pelourinho. Two black trans women spoke out about how trans women and travestis are also a part of the black women's movement and how they are especially vulnerable because they are often locked out of the job market due to their gender identity. At some point, it began raining, first a sprinkle and then a downpour. The crowd dispersed a bit around Praça da Sé, but the rain did not dissipate the energy of the march. Once the rain passed, the crowd regathered and continued onward. That felt symbolic to me somehow. Much like the struggles that black women face, we protect ourselves from the rain, but then regroup, find strength and solidarity among our sisters, and continue on our way. So these are just a few pictures that I took from the march of some of the signs that people had. The theme in the top corner, Mulheres Negras por un Nordeste Livre, and then people showing statistics, such as 503 women victims of aggression each hour. Without women, there are no politics, and then another commemorating the date of 25th of July. So based on longitudinal ethnographic research on black feminist activism in Salvador, Bahia, that I've been engaged in over the last 6 years, this lecture interrogates how black feminists in Bahia have adapted to the political and economic crises in Brazil. It offers ethnographic examples of how black feminist activists have resisted efforts to silence their voices, confronted Brazil's shift toward conservatism and authoritarianism, and adapted to the changing political circumstances in Brazil. In interviews with black feminist activists, I was struck by the prevalence of two words, aquilombar-se and ancestralidade. Admittedly, while I was of course familiar with the history of the term quilombo, think of Zumbi, Palmares, I had never heard aquilombar-se used as a verb before. What I learned was that black feminists in Bahia were aquilombando-se as a political strategy to respond to recent social, political, and economic challenges in Brazil. This meant that they were coming together, uniting in a metaphorical quilombo, which would allow them to gather their strength to combat racism, sexism, lesbophobia, and the other challenges. Aquilombar-se is a political strategy that is grounded in the belief that black women will be the ones to shake things up and to make changes. I was also struck by the common theme of ancestralidade in discussion with black women activists, with how they use their connections to and knowledge of their African heritage, ancestry, culture, and religiosity to face the challenges of this political conjuncture. So these, what I'm showing here, just some of the images of Julio das Pretas, the logos that have happened over the year and over the 7 years, and also the logos of ODADA, the Institute of Black Women. And so this work that I'm presenting today is part of my larger book project, Constructing Afro-Brazilian Feminisms, Black Women's Activism in Northeast Brazil, in which I conceptualize Black Brazilian feminisms in a holistic way to include aesthetics, politics, cultural valorization, and religiosity, and document the types of organizations, projects, and campaigns in which Black Brazilian feminists have been involved. This project explores the roles that sexuality and religiosity play in Black women's political mobilization and social movement activism. I ask, what weight do stereotypes of Black women's sexuality have on their behaviors, practices, and desires? How has Black women's activism been transformed and impacted by recent political and economic upheavals and transitions in Brazil? And finally, how can scholars draw upon Black Brazilian feminisms to highlight the transnational nature of feminisms and build real and lasting transnational solidarity across the African diaspora? This project was inspired in part by my participation in the UNCF Mellon International Faculty Seminar in Salvador entitled Constructing Women in the African Diaspora, Identities, Culture, and Power in July 2011. This seminar brought together an interdisciplinary group of Afro-Brazilian and African-American scholars. And I remember attending a presentation, and you facilitated, Keisha Comperi also facilitated one of these Mellon seminars. I don't remember if it was this year or the following year, right? The following year. So this, in 2011, it was facilitated by Kim Butler. I remember attending a presentation by Carla Acochireni Santos, a Black Brazilian woman who at the time was a graduate student in the master's program in gender and feminism at UFBA, the Federal University of Bahia, and now she's the author of Interseccionalidade in the Feminisms Plurais series coordinated by Jamila Ribeiro. In describing her research on incarcerated Afro-Brazilian women, I was struck by how well-versed she was in the work of U.S. Black feminists, despite the fact that she was not fluent in English. I wondered how many Black feminist scholars in the U.S., or feminist scholars in general, are as familiar with Black Brazilian feminist scholars. Do we know about Lélia Gonzalez, Luisa Bairros, Sueli Carneiro, Edna Holland, Jurema Werneck, and Beatriz Nascimento? That experience inspired my current research project on Black feminist activism in Bahia. My interest in Black women's agency and resistance in the face of harsh conditions is a thread that links my first research project on the sexual economies of tourism in Bahia to my current work. This project is also inspired by theoretical and methodological contributions of activists in Black feminist anthropology. Charles Hale, of course, argues that activist research should help scholars understand the root causes of inequality, oppression, and violence, and serve the needs of the people who are affected by the topic. Similarly, Irma McLaurin asserts that Black feminist anthropologists must do research that seeks to alleviate conditions of oppression through scholarship and activism. And in this tradition of Cite Black Women, I must also highlight the field-building work of Kia Caldwell, who I understand was here, I believe, last week, giving a talk, Keisha Comperi, and Kristen Smith, who have also worked to build transnational connections between Black feminist thought in Brazil and the U.S. And finally, I aim to situate this work in progress as a feminist ethnography. And in their recently published textbook, Donna Ayin Davis and Krista Craven contend that feminist ethnographers make our work meaningful to the problems of ordinary people and do work that can impact people's lives for the better. We should also make it accessible in language and availability, collaborative, and work with social movements that can use our work to help bring about change. Davis and Craven go on to say that, quote, our methodology, the rationale we create for the links we make among feminist theory, our research strategies and ethical decisions, the data we collect, and its relevance to the world is what marks our research as feminist ethnography. The active Black feminism in Brazil, just kind of to give a context or a little bit of background before I get into some of the interviews. The activism and intellectual production of Black Brazilian feminists has been fundamental to the construction of Black feminist thought and theory in Brazil. As Kia Caldwell notes in Transnational Black Feminism in the 21st Century, Black women's transnational activism has had a profound impact on policy developments in Brazil. She documents the history of the emergence of the Black women's movement in Brazil during the late 1980s with organizations like Maria Mulher in Porto Alegre and GLD in Sao Paulo as the oldest Black women's organizations in Brazil. So like U.S. Black feminists, many Black Brazilian feminists embrace the concept of intersectionality. However, Brazilian Black feminists have been more invested in the Black movement in Brazil due to exclusions and injuries sustained in the women's movement. Lélia Gonzalez noted that the Black movement in Brazil provided a space for discussions and development of a political consciousness about racism and class exploitation, while the women's movement ignored the racial question altogether. One of my interviewees, Sandra, said, quote, I felt co-opted by men to do tasks for them in mixed groups. Even with the strong women's nucleus, women became tarefeiras, or the people who would do tasks. Lélia Gonzalez embraced a transatlantic vision of Black feminism, and she even coined the term Americanidade as a tool to understand the broader Black experience in the Americas. And Keisha Comperi has also written about this. Americans, she contends, quote, were seen as animalized bodies, the sexual beasts of burden. And Sueli Carneiro, founder of GLD, Instituto da Mulher Negra, asserted that Black women exhibited a, quote, double militancy because they had to ensure that gains that they made in the racial field were not nullified by persistent gender inequalities, and that gains made in the feminist movement did not only privilege white women. There's also a long history of NGOization of Black feminism in Brazil. Lícia Barbosa refers to this, to NGOization. And also feminist anthropologist Jennifer Wise discusses NGOization in the context of domestic violence shelters in the United States, arguing that the process of NGOization transforms social movement activities from protest politics to policy work, through the development and institutionalization of social movement organizations. So characterized by the bureaucratization of grassroots organizations and an emphasis on policies and procedures over activism, WISE sees NGOization as the imposition of neoliberal political economy on advocacy. So reflecting on the Brazilian context, Sonia Wider Maluf notes that while NGOization has transformed activists into, quote, professionals who are increasingly dependent on financing from international agencies, end quote, it is also worth pointing out that the institutionalization of some groups as NGOs was, quote, perhaps the only option for maintaining these groups at a time of professionalization of political life. Many Black Brazilian feminists consider academic feminism to be something that is produced exclusively by white women. And both Lelia Gonzalez and Luisa Baihus claim that the liberation of white women was related to the continued subordination of Black women as domestic workers. And even today, racial tensions between Black and white Brazilian women are manifested in multiple ways. White feminists often considered Black women to be, quote, aggressive or non-feminist because of their insistence that racism and its practices should be taken into consideration in feminist struggles. That's quoting from Lelia Gonzalez. And ultimately, Brazilian feminists want Black women's issues to be seen as an indispensable component of women's issues rather than merely a sub-theme. In my interview with a prominent Black lesbian activist leader, she said, quote, when it's time to vie for positions of power, Black feminists will be there waiting for white feminists to nominate you, but she will never suggest you because she never believes that you have the competence to be in that place before her. She is the one who has the competence to be in that place, end quote. And she went on to articulate some of the differences between white and Black women that play a role in the feminist concerns. Quote, we live in different societies. I say this because society does not offer us the same condition. No white woman will run the risk of the police invading her house because her son is smoking marijuana in the backyard. We live this every day, and it's not necessarily because our son is smoking marijuana. White women were demanding daycare in the 20th century, and we Black women are still demanding daycares until today. The feminist movement is complex because it creates traps for Black women, because the movement seems to welcome our demands, but it doesn't welcome them. So the conflict with white women stays hidden. It seems like it's better with them, but it's not, end quote. Similarly, in my interview with the group of women who worked for Odara, Fernanda stated, quote, white women is very exclusive. They really take us out of the scene. Many of us begin to read Black authors through white feminists who bring them to our attention, but they don't even realize that once we have access to these Black feminists, we will break with them, end quote. And finally, Luciana, a 40-year-old Afro-Brazilian woman who I interviewed, recounted her experience being employed as a domestic worker. When she decided that she wanted to go to university at the age of 29, the daughter of her boss said, why do you want to study when you already have a job here as a domestic worker? Luciana reflected, in other words, she was trying to say, that was my place. Meu lugar era aquele. Black Brazilian feminists like Lelia Gonzalez, Sueli Carneiro, and others boldly claimed a voice and space for Black Brazilian women. Like Audre Lorde's exhortation that your silence will not protect you, Lelia Gonzalez emphasized the importance of, quote, speaking with all of its implications. She said that Black Brazilians, quote, have been spoken about, infantilized, and now will assume their own speech. And so these are just pictures of some Black feminists who are very prominent in Bahia. Valdecir Nascimento is the founder and executive coordinator of Odara. Vilma Hayes is a sociologist and prominent Black feminist activist who is actually running for mayor of Bahia right now. Luisa Baihus passed away a few years ago and was a minister of Sepir. And Makota Valgina, who's in the Candomblé community, also speaks out about religious racism, what some people have called religious intolerance, but she actually coined that it should be called religious racism instead. So to kind of go back, so it's kind of a tale of two marches. So I want to go back to 2015 with the national march that happened in Brasilia. So on November 18, 2015, thousands of Black Brazilian women descended upon Brasilia to hold the first Marcha das Mulheres Negras, contra o racismo, a violência e pelo bem viver, so against racism, violence, and for the good life or well-being, to protest racism and violence. This historic event is indicative of a groundswell of Black feminist activism that has been sweeping the Brazilian nation in recent years. The idea for the march emerged in Salvador in 2011 and soon developed into a national mobilization reaching several states all over the nation. In a video by the March Committee from Pernambuco, Black feminist activists articulate some of the issues and concerns underlying the march, including a concern about violence against Black women being treated like objects, the recognition that racism mistreats and kills people, the lack of abortion rights, and the genocide against Black youth. Ultimately, Black feminist activists are fighting for a society free of racism, sexism, and lesbophobia. When Valdecir Nascimento spoke at the UN Commission on Women, she reflected on the march, saying, quote, "Women came by buses and by boats. They cooked, they danced, and they marched together. It was beautiful. Some 70,000 women came to Brasilia for the march. We stopped the capital. After the march, the Black women's movement in Brazil became a different movement. For Black women, it was an affirmation of their strength. The dialogue to advance Black women's rights should put them in the center. We don't want others to speak for Black feminists, neither white feminists nor Black men," end quote. In an interview with some of the activists who work for Odara, they also reflected on their experiences at the march, saying, quote, "It was one of the best things that the Black women's movement has been able to do in the country, in the sense of a global action that considered all of the processes of articulation that Black women have been doing. It was an action that mobilized all of the states in Brazil. We managed to create a march where you had everything. There were lesbians, candomblé women, quilombola women, domestic workers, women in wheelchairs, evangelical women, youth, hip-hop women. You had everything, whatever you like. It was so grand. It wasn't a march of revindication. It was a march of denouncing. We worked within our guidelines, drawn from Black feminism, drawn from everything that happens with Black women. But in the march, there was a feeling of denouncing and saying to the Brazilian state that it is no longer possible to kill us, to enter our houses and our communities to kill us," end quote. And it's interesting here to reflect on the difference between revindication, defined as to demand and take back, and denouncing, defined as to criticize someone or something strongly and publicly. Perhaps it's useful to think of denuncias as what Robin Kelly calls freedom dreams of a Black Brazilian feminist radical imagination. The 2015 Black Women's March in Brasilia was a watershed moment in the contemporary history of Black feminist activism in Brazil. However, this mobilization has also been challenged continuously as the political and economic crisis has unfolded. In the last 4 years, as you know, Brazil has hosted the World Cup in 2014, the Summer Olympics in 2016, witnessed the ouster of President Dilma Rousseff, what many refer to as a legal coup, the incarceration of former President Luiz Lula da Silva, and the political assassination of Black feminist councilwoman Marielle Franco in 2018. Another Odara activist reflected on the significance of the march in the political moment as it occurred, quote, "when the most visible and aggressive process of the golpe, or coup, just began." She said, "I believe the march gave a rise in the social movements. We needed to go to the streets. We were in a process of constantly losing rights, and we are facing the threat of living a process of golpe in the country. We need a way to manifest." The other important aspect of the march is the process of strengthening the Black women's organizations in the regions. Today, you have the Northeast region with an organized Rede de Mulheres Negras, or network of Black women. The process of organization began before the march, but the march has played a role in enhancing the actions of this network, end quote. So now I want to shift gears to talk a little bit more specifically about ancestralidade and candomblé. So these are pictures, more pictures that I took from the march in 2019 in Salvador. And you see the women pictured are Irmãs de Boa Morte, some of the sisters from the Sisterhood of the Good Death in Cachoeira. So the Sisters of the Irmandade de Boa Morte opened the Marcha das Mulheres Negras in Salvador this past July as a symbolic act of reverence to what Afro-Brazilians call ancestralidade. Literally translated as ancestry or ancestrality, ancestralidade is much more than family or genetics. It has to do with African cultural heritage, as well as the practices, aesthetics, and religiosity that have fortified Afro-Brazilians and given them the strength to resist enslavement, colonization, and continued racial oppression in Brazil. Ironically, while at the march, while Odara staff were asking for people to clear a path to allow these elder Black women from Boa Morte to open the march, to kind of start us, move us from Praça da Piedade to marching on Avenida Sete, The media, the news media, swarmed in front of the Irmas, the sisters. Journalists stuck microphones in their faces in their attempts to do video interviews with the women. It was a tense and awkward moment in which the media clearly was acting in their own interest, but ironically, literally holding up the progress of the march. Cheryl Sterling's work argues that Afro-Brazilian women use the practice of candomblé as a quote, site from which to gain personal power and agency in a social and political climate that continues to treat them as sub-citizens. Further, she claims that activists, whether initiated in candomblé or not, view the Africanness of candomblé, quote, as a counter-narrative to the processes of embranquecimento, or whitening, and the myth of racial democracy. In Mulher Negra, Afetividade e Solidão, a book published in 2013 by Bahian professor Ana Claudia Pacheco, this book explores the affective choices that Black women in Salvador make in a context in which they are naturalized as part of the markets of sex, eroticization, and domestic work. Pacheco offers in-depth life stories of Black activist and non-activist women. Many of the women that she interviewed were from precarious, poor backgrounds, and they viewed politics as an important marker in the reorientation of their affective trajectories. Interestingly, Pacheco found that candomblé played a central role in constructing the identities of Black women activists because it essentially orients their relationships with the world and their bodies. One of Pacheco's interviewees, Dandara, an activist who incorporated symbols of Afro-Brazilian religion and the orishas into her aesthetic, said, quote, I believe that it's impossible for you to be a Black woman, na integridade, or wholly, fully, without you being in a terreiro de candomblé, because it's the only place where you can be free. It's the only place where we can be 100% Black, end quote. So this was the common theme that I found in many of my interviews. One woman, Luciana, said that candomblé is connected to activism because Afro-Brazilians are returning to the religion that was taken from them. Sandra commented that, quote, every person of Axé is an activist because our practices are counter-hegemonic, end quote. Lydia, a 20-year-old college student who self-identified as a candomblécista and was involved with the group Negras Jovens Feministas, discussed the prevalence of youth who are searching for ancestralidade. She said that candomblé demands a lot of responsibility and focus from its adherents. Like Sandra, she also commented that it's impossible to be a candomblécista and not be an activist, and she calls the terreiro an alternative reality to the state, end quote. Jacira, a 51-year-old Black lesbian activist from the Suburbio Ferroviario, said that, quote, our ancestralidade is not just in our phenotype, but also in our sacred, in what is sacred within us. It's this force that kept us alive during the slave trade and that keeps us alive in the diaspora, end quote. Similarly, another Black lesbian activist who I interviewed noted that her Orisha, Oshosi, and Shango gave her the energy for her activism. When prominent Mãe de Santo Mai Val of the Terreiro do Cobre came to speak at Spelman College a few years ago, she discussed the difficulty of doing activism in Brazil at a time when the government took away the Ministry for Racial Justice and Women's Rights. She said, quote, where can we go to demand our rights? One of the few places left for us are our religious spaces. They are spaces of resistance. In these times when it feels like our country is regressing, it is important to have our religion to give us strength, end quote. I also interviewed a 30-year-old Black trans woman named Tatiana who said that her ancestralidade brought her to where she was today. She said, quote, terreiros are quilombos of resistance and spaces of fortalecimento, or strengthening, and that ancestralidade strengthens my activism. And finally, Fabiana, a 31-year-old activist who was raised in candomblé, said that candomblé made her into a woman with certain values that contribute towards activism. Quote, inside the terreiro, I learned values and behaviors of African descent that helped me to maintain myself in activism. So thinking about a way forward to conclude. Jaira Harrington's work based in Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro contends that Black Brazilian women's leadership around economic access and education is motivated and characterized by their status and life experiences at the intersections of class inequality, racial democracy, and machismo. She emphasizes the context in which Black women are living in Brazil. They suffer from the highest levels of unemployment and the lowest monthly earnings, and they are more likely to be overrepresented in poverty, have limited access to sufficient health care for themselves and their families, have inadequate access to education and public services, among other things. Finally, she advances a Black feminist approach to politics on social equality and justice, stands to inspire innovation and creativity for future inclusionary policies in Brazil, end quote. So it is the reference to future inclusionary policies that gives me pause at this moment. Harrington's article was published in 2009, and as we know, in March 2018, Marielle Franco was assassinated with 4 shots to the head after leaving the Young Black Women Moving Structures event at the Casa das Pretas in Rio de Janeiro. Marielle Franco was a 38-year-old Black queer woman from the favela who was a single mom at 19, who studied sociology and public administration, who later became the only Black woman on Rio's city council. She was a model for all of us. She shattered stereotypes about what working-class Black women single mothers are capable of and overcame the many obstacles in her life to reach an influential leadership position. Days before her death, she tweeted about the epidemic of police violence in the favelas, asking how many more have to die. One of my interviewees, Adriana, was struck by the fact that besides having her assistant and driver in the car, Marielle was alone. Adriana said, "Our bodies are alone when we are not aquilombadas. When we aren't able to aquilombar, we end up suffering. Bolsonaro being in power made it so that we had to wake up and aquilombarse more. We will have to either take power or leave the country." So I keep using the word in Portuguese because I'm not sure how to translate it in the sentence, so I think I'm going to keep it in Portuguese. Aquilombar as a verb that comes from the noun quilombos, referencing the history of Afro-Brazilians' resistance to enslavement. At the Seminário Internacional O Estado e a Violência contra Mulheres Negras na América Latina e Caribe, this was a seminar that happened in July when I was there this past summer, organizers called the assassination of Marielle Franco a feminicídio político, a political feminicide. Rio's governor named March 14th Marielle Franco Day against the genocide of Black women. And the ordinance states that the day should be used to promote community-wide discussion and reflection on the killings of Black women in Brazil through lectures and public debates, hope raising out of despair. However, shortly after Jair Bolsonaro was elected president of Brazil, an image of 2 Bolsonaro supporters holding a broken Marielle Franco street sign went viral. They both had smiles on their faces, and one was even flexing his muscles. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. In the October 2018 elections, over 1,200 Black women ran for offices in Brazil, and there were several victories, including Erika Malunguinho, who became the first transgender woman elected to a state congress in Sao Paulo. Malunguinho described being inspired to run for office by the murder of Marielle. There's a quote from her in an article that read, "I cried a lot when I heard about Marielle's murder. Her political project was just wiped out. It was a message to us that we should not be there fighting over our bodies and resisting genocide and harm. I had so much hate in me. At the same time, I knew I needed to take this hate and do something positive with it." So we can see the impact of what some call the sementes de Marielle, or the seeds of Marielle, in Brazil as well. In July, when I was in Bahia, many Black women were preparing to launch their campaigns for various political offices, including mayor and city council, vereadora. There was also a newly formed entity called Forum Marielles. The idea emerged from a desire to pay homage to Marielle Franco 1 year after her assassination. Organizers invited Black women from various segments of the Black women's movement to convene at CEAU, the Center for Afro-Oriental Studies, which is a part of the Federal University of Bahia. Ana Claudia Pacheco suggested that they create the Forum Marielles as a space to mature and amplify discussions about the political representation of Black women. By the summer, the impact of Bolsonaro's policies in education was already being felt, as they lost access to space at CEAU because of budget cuts affecting public universities. For instance, there was no water, and they could no longer have events in CEAU after 1:30 p.m. Oh, wait. So these are just some flyers of some of the candidates. Jandira Mausi is running for vereadora. Olivia Santana is running for mayor. And the image at the top is a flyer for an event that Forum Marielles held. We invite you, Black women, neighborhood leaders, social movement, people in social movements, housewives, students. You, Black women, are invited to come understand and become a part of the movement that will change history, the political and social history of our city. So people always talk about Bahia as being, you know, one of the blackest cities in Brazil, but yet the representation of Black people in political positions of power has been very, very small. And so this also is a representation, a logo of the Foro Marielles, and some other. You know, at the bottom is another Black women's group, MAIN, Organização das Mulheres Negras, started a English class for Black women activists, and I was invited to speak at the first meeting. But you know, thinking about different ways of empowering Black women activists in Bahia. This is another event. So Salvador, the Black city run by white men. Black women say enough. And so Olivia Santana and Vilma Hayes, pre-candidates to become the mayor of Salvador. So on the Foro Marielles de Salvador, they wrote a manifesto, and I really liked. I thought the beginning of the manifesto really connects to this idea of ancestralidade. They say, somos herdeiras de povo que acreditou na liberdade, mesmo quando este projeto parecia uma ficção. We are descendants of a people who believed in freedom, even though the project seemed to be fiction. And you can read on, you know, we are the fruit of a tradition of Black women warriors in a daily fight for survival. We are descendants of hundreds of Black women's religious sisterhoods that fought for their own freedom and that freed us. We are direct descendants of the Sisterhood of the Good Death. We are daughters, granddaughters, and great-granddaughters of Mãe Stella de Oxóssi, Makota Valdina, and many other religious leaders in Candomblé who resisted con silencio o con feitiço, who resisted either with silence or with, how do you translate feitiço? Magic? ¿Cómo? Spell, or, you know, yeah, spell, the violence of the state. We are the project of continual fight for freedom. And they conclude the manifesto by saying, I didn't put that on the slide, but somos a luta contínua pela liberdade e consideramos que a nossa emancipação política só ocorrerá com a superação de todas as formas de opressão. Somos o sonho e o projeto político de igualdade e justiça. Somos Marielles, aquilombadas em conexões às mulheres. So we are the continued fight for freedom, and we consider that our freedom, our political freedom, will only occur when we overcome all forms of oppression. So very much reminiscent of Combahee River Collective. We are the dream and the political project of equality and justice. We are Marielles, aquilombadas, in connections with women. And then it's signed by a list of 100 Black women's entities, organizations, social movements, and tejeros. So to conclude, you know, and I attended another Foro Marielles event on July 18th that brought together Black women leaders from various leftist parties. And one prominent Black feminist activist, Lindy Nalva de Paula, stated at the Seminario Internacional, quote, "The movement of Black women is what is leading the country," end quote. So I will stop there, and I'm open to any questions that you have.